Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on this cold DC morning here, welcoming Michael Faby and discussing his new book, Crashback, The Power Clash Between the U.S. and China in the Pacific. Michael's had a long and distinguished career and support on military and naval affairs for most of it. In addition to his work for the National Geographic Traveler, The Economist Group, Defense News, Aviation Week, and Jane's, he's collected more than 24 reporting awards, including the prestigious Timothy White Award. Few journalists have such extensive firsthand experience of America's naval ships and aircraft as sailors and the officers who command them. A Philadelphia native, he currently resides in Spotsylvania, Virginia, and Crashback is his first book. So I had the great opportunity to read Michael's book here with this event coming up, and in my opinion, he does an excellent job. This book is of explaining, as he calls this current warm war being waged between the U.S. and China, and it's written not for policy wonks like myself and DC think tankers or the naval officers, but I think it's written for every American who wants to understand what's going on out there and why we're there. He explains to the historical and current reasons for the tension between China, the U.S., and its allies, but he also paints a vivid picture of just how dangerous naval operations on the sea and in the air are on a daily basis, and how aggressive and irresponsible actions, coupled with a disregard for international maritime law and long-standing military codes of professional conduct, can turn deadly in an instant. In my opinion, Michael's book provides a clear explanation of the why the U.S. and its Navy must maintain an enduring forward presence in the Pacific, especially the South China Sea, why the Chinese are trying to become the dominant naval force in the Pacific after having a practically non-existent Navy for almost 600 years, and why the U.S. must not underestimate the capabilities and proficiency of the modern Chinese Navy. I know there'll be academics and DC policy analysts that will disagree with the picture Michael paints of the Chinese government and its Navy. I may be personally biased because I was already on his side of the fence on this issue before I read his book. But to those, as Michael calls, panda huggers, I will repeat something my grandmother said to me when I was a young lad: actions speak louder than words. And if you look at what China's been doing, they've been transmitting a very clear message to the U.S. and its South China Sea neighbors through its actions over the past several years. And the book points out several examples of where Chinese words are often outright lies or represent some alternate reality the Chinese are trying to prevail. Michael's book kind of concludes in late 2016, right after the election, of where things potentially might go. And so the events that have happened in 2017 of U.S. ship collisions and other actions happening in the 7th Fleet AOR, I think have only increased the spotlight on this region and the U.S. Navy. I think making Michael's book even more timely and important for any reader who's interested. It is my proud honor to welcome Michael Faby.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. First, let me just address the panda hugger thing. I'm not that smart to coin such a phrase. So I like most good writers, I steal from other folks. That's a phrase that was floating around the Pentagon and the Navy circles for a while now. But I think it applies pretty appropriately throughout the book. And I thought I'd start a little bit by getting to one question that kind of comes up whenever I do speak about the book, and is how the idea first started. And really kind of have to go back to when I first started covering the Pentagon about a decade ago. And I was going throughout the Pentagon talking to folks, and the one thing kept on coming up was this whole idea of China. And I have to admit that before that, even though I'd been covering military for years and everything, I'd begun to think that China was sort of almost a made-up boogeyman. It was a reason, I thought, at the time to justify expensive acquisitions, to justify certain military policies. I really didn't give it much truck that China was as strong as powerful as folks said it was. And I have to say that I couldn't have been more wrong. The more I did the research, the more I talked to people, the more I traveled throughout Asia Pacific, the more I got on not only our ships, but on Chinese ships, for example, and the ships of our allies, the more I realized that China is a threat. It's not to say that China is a threat like the old Soviet Union was a threat. There you had diametrically opposed folks going at it no matter what, because China right now is a partner, but at the same time, for our very core national interests, it does represent a threat. And we really need to honor that, we really need to respect that, and at the very least, we need to acknowledge that. And that's what this book is about in so many ways. If there's any policy in there or any kind of big idea, is that we have to acknowledge that China's a threat. But beyond that, I really do try to stay away from policy. And there's a very important reason for that. And really had nothing to do with book sales, but it had a lot more to do with the fact that on any given day, in the skies and on the seas out in the Western Pacific, the chance between a peaceful resolution to any kind of incident and escalation of war will come down to a split second of what a commanding officer or a pilot does or does not do. And so that was what the impetus for my book was. I want to go out and find out what was in the minds and the hearts and kind of even the souls of these people out there who were going to be basically facing down the Chinese. And they were. They have been facing down the Chinese. And it was important to find out what their orders were, what their mindset was. And so that's what we try to do. This basically is a big sea yarn, if you will, with a bunch of little sea yarns in the track. The big sea yarn is about how the U.S., thanks to some admirals who got into very important positions, finally got moved along, if not the administration, certainly Pentagon, to respect the Chinese more as an adversary. And that's the kind of big sea yarn here. But the other is the little stories about the men and women in uniform out there who every day, I mean, okay, this is not one of these things where you have a big war, people are just throwing bombs around, or even a Cold War kind of thing where the nuclear clock is ticking. But anyone who's been at sea on any kind of ship like this realizes this is a floating industrial zone with weapons. The slightest little error can lead to death, maiming, I mean, destruction of a ship even. So this is what they do every single day, and at the same time, face an adversary over there who's out to try to trip them up, to try to cause them to make an error in judgment, to try to cause an incident that will cause the U.S. to back off. And here's the important thing to think about. What if the U.S. backs off? What if, and this would be China's dream, by the way, the U.S. were to go back, not only to Guam, but even to Pearl Harbor? What would happen? What would it be like if under a world where China kind of ruled the seas over there? Now, China says, look, we're all about trade, so they don't want to upset that apple cart. But at the same time, if they controlled it, it could be a kind of situation where they could decide what ships can go through, what ships can't. They could decide possibly to make it more difficult for shipping to take place, for trade to take place. If you like going to Walmart and buying a couple $100 computer or laptop, that may not be the case in years to come. Because the one thing that's been constant over the last 7 decades, at least, is the U.S. has kept those lanes open. You know, if you want to get down to this is the economic war. And that's why, you know, it's important for America to keep the ships out there, to keep them operating. And as we found out just in the past, half year or so, that's not as safe as it seems even just to operate on a day-to-day basis. Because the U.S. has been so busy trying to keep those sea lanes open, trying to make sure they put up the best front, trying to keep their presence out there. They've had their ships run into other ships. They can't even get their basic seamanship down because they've been too busy trying to do that than to keep their own house safe. And so right now, the important thing is that we have to get back, on one sense, the sense of seamanship, make sure we have safe operations out there because we need to operate. And if anything shows that more than anything else right now, it's going on with North Korea. Because right now, if the U.S. isn't out there, do you think that North Korea would stop its missile testing? I do think it's kind of interesting to note that when the U.S. had the 3 carriers out there in the Sea of Japan, and I was on the Nimitz at the time, North Korea didn't try any test, although supposedly there's some testing that was scheduled to take place. But no one's going to take a test out there with carriers and they're escort ships that are loaded up with ballistic missile defense systems on it. So that's why I think this is important here. So at any rate, I'd like to take the questions.
Robert Weiner. I'm a center associate at the Davis Center for Russian Eurasian Studies at Harvard, and also the academic editor of the McGraw-Hill series on global issues.
Morning.
And Graham Allison out at Harvard has come up with this idea of the Thucydides trap, where he thinks that he's sort of a neo-realist approach. The structure of the international system is inevitably going to lead to a war between the U.S. and China. I was wondering what you thought of that.
This is the one that basically says that, hey, if you have one power that's dominant, and our power is going to come up, that there's almost going to be, it's destined that they're going to clash. I would say that right now, at current time, China will not push it that way. They're not ready yet. They are not ready yet. They are almost ready. They figure, well, I would say most military leaders and things like that, maybe by 2049, they might be ready to kind of push things. That's the 100-year anniversary. But at any rate, is that Shane calling by any chance? Okay. So they're not ready yet. It's too early to suggest that that will be the case anytime soon. However, certainly there could be an escalation. And that escalation would come from a miscalculation. And that's the biggest question right now, is that up until now, for the most part, the U.S. has been the calm actor in a bunch of incidents that are kind of laid out in the book, where China, rogue pilots, rogue ship captains have rammed our aircraft or threatened to ram our ships. And in some cases, actually rammed our ships even. And it's, oh, this has nothing to do with us and everything like that. And so far, the U.S. has been the kind of the, okay, we understand, you know, you're at the big boys' table and you haven't quite learned how to use your forks yet. Will that be the situation as we go forward? The current administration has not exactly been very consistent on how it might handle a situation like that. And that's the biggest concern right now, is I don't think that China would push the issue right now, and certainly the U.S. isn't. The question will be, though, if some kind of miscalculation erupts in the escalation of forces that gets out of control, we can't control. And the other part, of course, is on the whole North Korea front. If the U.S. were to do, for example, a preemptive strike, that what could be the dominoes of that could actually get U.S. and China involved in some kind of conflict? And there's a whole bunch of different scenarios where that could happen. So if the status quo remains, I don't think we have to worry about that right now. I do think it's edging that way. And I mean, you know, has there ever been time in history where the king of the mountain said, oh, here you go, take my spot, you know? There hasn't, not really. And so I don't think the U.S. is going to give up its top spot very willingly.
Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Kraus. I'm
Morning.
chairman of Secure Chain. And what I'd like to do is have a little bit of a preface and then ask you a question. 1914, biggest trading partner with Great Britain was Germany.
Mm-hmm.
No one thought that those two great nations would go to war. Point one. Point two is the use of a satellite state, Russia and Serbia. Again, 1914, Russia backed Serbia in a terrorist act. Unexpected terrorist act, but one planned. Fast forward, Sun Tzu tells us that the greatest acme of skill is to win without fighting. You've touched 2049. Most Americans would say, hey, am I going to be around in 2049? But at that stage, the win without fighting will be there. Mm-hmm. The rogue state, North Korea, is the wild card, the Serbia of 1914. And from that, the miscalculation by that state on who backs who led us into the conflict. Your comments, please.
Okay, first to get back to the, going back to pre-World War I mean, that's very true. That history is replete with wars that no one thought would happen because they were trading partners, because they were allies and everything like that. The fact that we are close trading partners with the Chinese, I don't think will have much to do with anything if things get to a head. You know, I really don't, because it hasn't proved to be the case throughout history. So I think that we cannot just rely on that. I mean, you know, true, with the old-time Soviet Union Cold War type of thing, we didn't have to worry about that at all. With China, we do. And also with our allies, they're all trained partners of China and everything like that. It's a lot more complex now, complicated. But at the same time, when it comes right down to it, security is the number one thing on anyone's mind. You know, I remember I was in Australia and they said, yeah, you know, talking to some of the political and military leaders down there, they said, well, the U.S. is our wife and China is our mistress. In other words, we rely on the U.S. for security and China is our trade partner. And I said, well, if it came right down to it, who would you rather have in your corner? Oh, right now, security is number one. Because without security, you can't have anything else, really. So I do think that we have to keep that in mind. As for the satellite kind of country idea, this is not the first time that we've had China, you know, or try to rely on China to help, you know, as a kind of go-between with another Asian country. Because the fact of the matter is that, especially right now, it serves China's best interest to have unrest and unstable Western Pacific as a result in another Asian country. It really does. And to expect that China's going to come through and solve all our problems or all our concerns with North Korea, I think is sort of just being a bit naive. Does that answer your question, or do you have another part there? Oh, okay. So,
Next question. Oh, right.
Hi, Michaela Dodge. I'm here at Heritage.
morning.
I know you try to steer away from policy recommendations, so I'll ask in a more general way. What can you do when another state is intent on changing the status quo that you want to preserve?
Hold the line. I mean, you know, really, one of the biggest frustrations that I heard at the Pentagon from some of the top admirals was the unwillingness of the Obama administration to go out just once in a while, stick their foot out and trip up the Chinese. You know, so, I mean, you've heard, I'm sure in the news, all this talk about the freedom of navigation, FONOPS, that was going on. The fact of the matter is they do it all the time, but they choose when to publicize it. You know, and so what they need to do is publicize that a lot more. They need to be out there and saying, look, we're not going to go out of our way, you know, to try to push you down the steps or anything like that. But we're going to do what we do every single day as a matter in the course of business. So you hold the line. About 2 or 3 years ago now, they decided to postpone some exercises they were scheduling. And it was after the Chinese had raised, you know, concerns about them. That's something you should never do. You just do what you're going to do normally and say, look, we're just doing what we do all the time, and you're welcome to come and join us. You know, you're welcome to come, just like RIMPAC exercise, invite the Chinese, come out and exercise with us. But you hold the line. I mean, that's probably the most important thing is you hold the line. You sail where you normally would sail. You go out and fly where you normally would fly. When they come up to bug you, just say, you know, we're here. We're not going to move. And if they push it, well, that's, you know, when you have to decide at some point in time, when they push it, is there going to be a danger to your aircraft or your ship? Well, sometimes, you know, you don't want to do anything that's going to basically cause a loss of life. But until that moment, you have to hold the line.
This gentleman down
My name is Mitsuo Nakai,
Good morning.
Japan native U.S. citizen. Two questions. Number one, both hypothetical, but
It's all
if
hypothetical right now, huh?
yeah, if something happens between the U.S. and North Korea,
Mm-hmm.
okay. One of the experts that I was talking to says China would help North Korea, or they will get involved.
Mhm.
I tend to agree with that, but not Russia. Russia probably won't get involved, soldier wise.
Mhm.
So that's my first question. The second question is
So who I think you would get involved?
the China.
Okay. Yeah.
The second question is I believe the Asia Pacific belongs to Asia Pacific countries, and they should take initiative, and they should be more assertive, without depending on America 100%. I'm not saying get out of it, America. That's not what I'm saying. I like to see a little more initiative. My point is, for example, speaking of China, what if Japan or South Korea go nuclear? They won't, but if they did, that's going to change the whole symmetrics in the Asia Pacific. So, what do you think of that?
Well, on the first part, whether or not China would get involved, China will do whatever China thinks is in its best interest. And so if they think at that time it's in their best interest to get involved, they will. And their biggest concern will be refugees. I mean, that's going to be their number one concern. Second will be more U.S. presence there on the peninsula. But the biggest concern is going to be refugees pouring over. So China will do at the time whatever is best for China, period. If you go back to the late 70s, when China invaded Vietnam, I mean, and it was a pretty, they took some heavy losses and everything else, but the whole idea was to message to the Soviet Union that they weren't going to listen to the Soviet Union's warnings against it, and at the same time send a message to the rest of Asia Pacific that Soviets don't really have your back as much as you thought. So China will do whatever it thinks it will be will come out as the best result for its own plans. And the second question again? Oh, well, right now, I mean, the biggest problem right now is Japanese Constitution, right? I mean, that's the whole thing is that, and even within Japan, as you know, there's just this debate about, they just can't get past that. Because I agree that on two fronts. One, that Asian countries have to take a little bit more to burn themselves. But quite honestly, who's going to lead that? The one that really should be leading that is Japan, if you look at it. I mean, they are the most sophisticated, the most advanced, the best positioned to. But because of the way their constitution is, they really can't. They're very much hamstrung. And now, if the U.S. decides to pull back for whatever reasons, Japan will have to look at that a little bit more carefully. So that's, and the other thing is the other Asian countries have to, once they get over, but there's still a lot of bad feeling from World War II and pre-World War II, with how Japan, when it went on its little spree around there, kind of acted towards other countries. Still a lot of ill feeling.
Next question, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. My name is Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong.
Okay.
I also have two questions. Number one, 2018 NDAA encourages the port calls between the United States and Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of the increasing competition in the West Pacific, do you believe the United States would really send a warship to Taiwan? This is the first question.
Okay.
And the second one is, I have heard a views or point from a Chinese expert saying that actually the risk of the Navy crash in the West Pacific is not from the miscalculation of the sailors on the front, because the guideline and the mechanism have been put into place, and the sailors would follow that. But the real risk will be from the commander in the headquarters, because they may order the sailor to go ahead and do something, and the sailor should follow the order from the commander, right?
Right.
Do you agree with that views or point?
Okay.
Thank you.
So the first point, when you say U.S. send a warship, do you mean a U.S. warship that's operated by the U.S. to Taiwan, or do you mean to sell, to try to basically send a U.S. warship there? I think it's more likely that you would see some Marines embarked from a U.S. ship going over. I think it's very likely to see an amphibious assault ship, for example. Not necessarily, which is a warship, but they don't have the same kind of, you don't have all the power you would have with a cruiser or destroyer, for example. So an amphibious assault ship that would be sent, so you basically would have embarked Marines, you would have Harriers or Joint Strike Fighters, depending on which one it is, and you would have helicopters and stuff like that. So you have a force that can go ashore and a force that's off the shore, but you don't have something that's loaded up with tomahawks and stuff like that. So I can see an amphibious assault ship being sent near Taiwanese waters. On the second one, they definitely, there is a bridge to headquarters communications open, usually on the internet and stuff like that. I can tell you that in the heat of things, that often gets ignored. Not because I don't care what the boss has to say back home. It's because things are going on, and they will go back and type what happened later. And I will tell you this, that first let's do on the American side, because I know that fairly well. On the American side, the number one intent, the number one priority of every commander at sea is to make sure his or her ship stays safe. Now, for war, they'll go into harm's way. I mean, that's their job. But in the situation where it's not war and everything like that, that's why you have the Crashback described in the book. They will do everything. That is their, I don't know if I'm an old Star Trek fan, and Jim Kirk was always saying, save my ship, no matter what. And quite honestly, that is ingrained to every command officer, to ship and sailors. Number one priority, no matter what, my ship's safety is what's important. Now, on the let's say Chinese side, because that's really what we're talking about. And I've only been on a couple of Chinese ships, so it's a lot. I don't have as much experience, let's put it that way. With that, I would say the Chinese leadership has a very long-range thinking and very strategic, even more than tactical, strategic feel for what's important, what's not. But I will tell you that the younger officers coming up have a much greater sense of, it's our time. That's why you've had some of these rogues come out once in a while. But I think the rogues of before are becoming more commonplace now with the current line. And they're not hungry for war. It's not that, but they are hungry to be respected, I guess is a good way to put it. I think there's a sense of they don't feel they had the respect out there, out at sea, that they deserve right now. Their ships are first class that they're putting out. I mean, they really are. The training now is becoming first class. So and that's the concern right there, is that if that kind of if an officer like that gets in charge of a ship, is like, all right, I'm going to show what I can do. I'm going to show what I'm capable. You're not respecting me. I'll make you respect me. Does that help? Okay.
Next question, the back. The one in the left. Right to the back. Get you next.
Hi, I'm Scott. I'm an intern here. Going back to China will do what's in the best interest of China. Do you see China being a rational actor, in the sense that the U.S. might have one idea of what's in China's best interest, while China has a completely different idea of
You
what's in their
described the
best
last
interest?
200 years, so, but anyway.
And I asked that, keeping in mind that they're tied with what we see as an irrational actor being North Korea.
Right. So do I think that China will be a rational actor? Yeah, not to be smart, but to answer your question, I think they will do what they think is rational acting. You know, if you go back, China is very sensitive to international perceptions about, especially what they do internally. So you have two things here. Is one, will they be a rational actor for how things are looked at internally? I think China is very sensitive about that. But externally, I do think that China, I think that they certainly will do their best to appear to be a rational actor in dealing with other militaries, and especially the American Navy. And I say that because of what they've done so far. That officially, every time there's been any kind of incident, China's not come out, you know, blustery, or at least not since the AP3 incident. They've always kind of, you know, officially come out with more of, oh, look, you know, this was an incident, we're going to work through this. They developed, for example, the QS, as they call it, that basically, when we meet at sea, how we're supposed to act together. So China has done all the right things officially to make themselves appear to be rational actors. At the same time, if you go to things like China Daily and everything like that, you'll see, you know, officials being a lot more belligerent, you know, and everything like that. So you have, you know, two messages going on. One, the broad international community, we're saying, hey, look, we are reacting as an international military naval force should act. And then the message internally as it goes out to all the different, you know, news organizations and everything like that is, hey, look, see what we did, and we're going to be tough and everything like that. So, is that answer? Okay.
Next question, the gentleman there on the red tie.
Good morning. I'm Tomo Endo. I'm a visiting fellow at Stimson Center. I came from Japan. So I have two questions, sir. So my first question is, during the Cold War, U.S. Navy and U.S. sailors, American sailors facing the big Soviet Navy in Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. So so is there, and now we are facing the Chinese Navy. So is there any lessons learned during the Cold War? And my second question is, so I read your book. I don't finish yet. So, but so that in your book, so young Chinese Navy lieutenant showed the big belief. So they want to be a big Navy. And they want to establish the great Navy again. So, and I think one of the problem comes from their strong belief. So and so it comes to it results to their assertive attitude in the Pacific. So and so, do you think they they will change their belief or their attitude? So
Okay. So the first question is, can we get lessons from the Cold War? Is that one of the things I think that the biggest lesson we can take is to basically be consistent and coherent. I mean, in other words, it was very clear in the Cold War what our end game was. And actually on the other side too, the end game is very clear for both sides on how we were going to conduct this strategy, if you will, this big game of Stratega, which was a big game when I was a kid. It was very clear what was going on, and in many ways that kept it from, you know, things from going too far a lot of times. So that's the biggest lesson, because right now I think there's just very much an inconsistency and incoherency about, you know, it was a little bit vague during the Obama administration, a little bit. I mean, they knew what they wanted to do. They weren't sure exactly how to use the military to do that. The whole rebound specific wasn't really kind of spelled out specifically the best way, you know. So, and right now, the change administration is sort of like, what is going on. And right now, it really is just, you know, if you talk to people in the Pentagon, they're not quite sure. They're just following what they were following under the Obama years, quite honestly. They're just following it through. And then the second question was again?
So in your book, so the
Oh,
young,
and will their attitudes change?
yes, that's right.
I think that their attitudes will change a lot more when the attitudes toward them change. When I was, it's described in the book, during RIMPAC, on one of the European participant ships, and I said, I was just on the Chinese shore to, you know, I could owe the Chinese, and there's a sense of, you know, what does that mean, you know? I mean, and they've been on the destroyer, they would realize it meant a lot. That, you know, if you were to go to a destroyer store, depending on the price, you know, pretty darn good. So I think as the attitude towards the Chinese Navy changes, as the international community recognizes them more as a partner in some ways, or at least someone to be reckoned with, I think then the Chinese will, you know, the officers, that the attitude I saw will start to you know, settle down, you know, because then they'll be getting respect, you know. So, and also if there's any kind of event where they get a chance to show how professional they are, you know, and that doesn't have to be combat, but humanitarian assistance or something along those lines, then I think that also will get a chance for them to show. And they've been doing that. China's been doing that. They've been participating in search and rescues. They've been participating in other humanitarian events, and doing a very good, solid job of it too. So I think as that happens more and more and more, and you get that kind of water under the keel, as they call it, then you'll see a change in that. Morning again.
Michael Krause again. I'm violating my own rule by asking a second question.
I think this is a third.
No, this is my second.
Okay. There was A and B the first time. Okay.
Could we talk a little bit about technology?
Okay.
And let me again preface that. Marshall started some of the near-peer competitive war games between the U.S. and China back in the 90s. And there were certain assumptions made of the changing technology capability of the Chinese. Fast forward now, they're building their third aircraft carrier. Fast forward to our recent awakening of what's embedded in chips and where are they made. Our awakening that some of our systems that we heavily depend upon for command and control, intelligence, and plain old steering are made in non-approved methods by the Chinese. And then let's look at that technology and your perspective, and then jump forward to Ghost Fleet.
I was going to ask if you read that, right?
And there make an assumption that Marshall did in the war games, that they are above us in some of the technology application in anti-ship and anti-area and all of those capabilities that they now are very close to having a superior overmatch for us. Your comment?
Well, if you remember back in 2008, they came out with the China Force Report for the Pentagon, and said China lacked the capability of doing a satellite shot, you know, anti-satellite shot, and they did one later that year with great success. I mean, China and Asia, I mean, have always continually surpassed what we thought they could do in terms of the technology realm that we operate. So I think that, you know, when you talk to Admiral Harris out in the Pacific Command, he always assumes the worst. He assumes that they are as good as what the people say they are, you know, to the very highest level, because he feels he has to. He has to assume they can do everything, you know, for example, that the DF-21 can actually hit a carrier. They haven't proved they have, but, you know, he has to assume that. I would say that the reason that they are able to go so fast in terms of technology is because, A, they're not afraid to fail. You know, if they have a failure, big deal, just move on. Here, if you have a failure, you have a congressional oversight committee ripping apart some of it. So that's the first part. The second part is they don't have the FAR, you know, federal regulations that basically make it almost impossible to get new technology fielded within less than 7, 8, sometimes 10 years. So by the time we get technology, we often have the same kind of great ideas about the same time. But by the time we can get out to the field, you've already gone through, the iPhone. We're putting out the iPhone 4, and they're going on to iPhone 11, and we already have people who have that kind of idea, but they're all it's so the domino goes backwards on that one. Now, whether or not that China has embedded some kind of secret code, if you will, that is above my pay grade, my intelligence, or anything like that. I would say that, given the realm of some of the things I know that we're working with technology, that something like that might be possible. And I would, I also know that we're working on some counters for checks for things like that. But I'm just not going to, because I just don't have the knowledge for anything like that. So, sorry.
Next question in the middle back.
My name is Jared Lin. I'm from TechRow. And I have two questions. The first one is I want to follow up on what you just mentioned about the FunUp. And while people say that the FunUp should be part of the greater strategy of the U.S. In the region, it should be it should be just one component of that. And besides that, beyond the FunUp, what do you think that should be in the strategy for the U.S.? And the second question is that it looks like that the code of conduct negotiation is going to begin soon. And I'd like to hear your views on what's the prospect given China's roles in the region and in this South China Sea dispute. Thank you.
On the first one, the freedom of navigation, one thing everyone should realize is they just decided to call it that, like relatively recently, like several years ago. Before, they just went out sailing. I mean, that's the thing. It used to be basically in the old days within cannon shot. That's how far you would get to someone's shores, within cannon shot. And that's because they keep the cannon, they can sink your ship. But we've always, going back now since the end of World War II, we've always sailed the seas in the Western Pacific, wherever we want it, and mostly just to make sure that there were no pirate attacks, that people weren't, raiding our people's. They didn't have economic zones back then, but basically everyone's being a good actor on the seas. That's sort of one of the reasons we were doing that stuff, and that was because, quite honestly, I mean, the biggest beneficiary of that has been the U.S. Biggest beneficiary of making sure the sea lanes stay open in the richest economic part of the world, make sure trade lanes stay open, has been the United States. So that's why we've been doing that. So several years ago, they started calling freedom of navigation. And that had a lot to do with because people were starting to declare economic zones and everything like that. So we had to basically come up how we can sail without violating someone's zone and everything like that. So okay, we're going to show we can sail there, but they'll call it freedom of navigation. And it should, quite honestly, put a name on it now has sort of kind of elevated to a point where it's now a talking point. But you're right, it should be just part of everyday business. That's all it should be. Everyday business, go out and do it. And so just part of a strategy, and maybe now I'm call it freedom of navigation to say sail in international seas, operate in international skies. What else should they be doing as a strategy? I get back to the answer I gave up here, which is basically hold the line. Don't say, oh yeah, we're going to, okay, here, you police that from now on, everything like that. No, it should be policing is the wrong word for it, saying we're going to sail here, the Japanese are going to sail here, Chinese can sail here, whoever can sail here, of course, it's international waters. And we're just going to make sure that everyone can do that. So I think that's the important part. Is just they're not U.S. waters. They're not U.S. shipping lanes. They're international shipping lanes. They're international skies, and so we're going to sail there. And when we're around, we're going to make sure everyone else can. Which? Oh, I'm sorry. The code of conduct. So I think that China probably will, as it worked through the first, what they call the QS, the first kind of code of conduct of these, they worked through that. They even to a point where they made sure that their officers understood English well enough to do it. And I think they'll continue with that with this. And then I think they'll violate it when it suits their interest.
Hi, David, also intern here. I think there's a tendency to look at militaries as being monolithic, but then you look at Iran and they have two navies, like the Artesh and the IRGC Navy, and then you made allusions to Imperial Japan, which had a lot of army and navy rivalries. I guess to cut it short, my question is, are there rivalries between, say, the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Army? And is the Chinese Navy, is its viewpoint perfectly congruent with the Chinese, the Communist Party, or do you get the sense that the Navy's more, ready to go, whereas the Communist Party is kind of more reserved, or vice versa?
On the first part, the Chinese Navy, especially compared to the rest of Chinese history, is a really new thing for China. You'd have to go back to, the grand fleets back centuries ago for that, any kind of naval force. Until then, everything was geared toward either some kind of land invasion or control within. And so everything went to your army. That was how the People's Liberation Army Navy is the official name of it. So, you got to keep that in mind. Now, having said that, over the last, especially 15 years, they've been robbing Peter for Paul. They've been taking money from the Army and putting it toward the Navy because basically now as China has become much more of a global actor in terms of trade. It's all about trade. It's all about making sure to get resources back so they can keep that very strong middle class kind of over there growing and getting stuff they want and everything like that. So as they had to develop those kind of trade lanes, as the U.S. did, over 150 years ago, they've been building up their Navy. And so I think you're going to continue to see that they're going to continue to build up their Navy in order to make sure, as the U.S. has done, using the Navy to help further the national interest. They're very big readers of Mahon, which basically, if you go back, that's where the whole U.S. idea of using the Navy for exactly the same thing started. So that's what I think you're going to see with that. You're going to see that more and more and more and more. And as is the Navy fatherhead of the government, that'll never happen. That just won't happen. As with this old Soviet regime, they have the folks on the ship, the commissar or whatever, who reports right back to the party, and every thing is within party lines and stuff like that. But that's not to say that they're automatons, because what struck me was not only the free thinking went on, but that they would feel so free to talk to an American reporter about their thoughts and feelings and everything like that. So I think from what I've understood, and it seems to bear us out, is that the government's idea is it's like a spigot. We're going to loosen it a little bit, so they don't feel bottled up, and so you get a lot of that out of there.
Any further questions?
Hi, I'm Toshi Hayakawa. Would you tell your assessment and analysis on the Trump administration approach to China? How different is China policy between the Obama administration and Trump administration?
Okay. Which phase? If you go back to when he was first elected, he took the phone call from Taiwan and said, "Oh, maybe we should just rethink this whole Taiwan policy thing." So that certainly didn't go well. And Tillerson, Rex Tillerson, when he was being going through the nomination process and everything like that, he said, "Oh, we're going to make sure his islands don't get near his islands and everything like that." So there seemed to be a very tough stance on China. But since then, it's sort of somewhat evolved, at least at the top levels of the administration, right? So you have two things going on. One is the top administration sort of saying, North Korea is going to help us with China. This is not the first administration mistakenly believed that China is going to help us with another Asian country. Because China, if it serves China's interests, China will do that. And I suggest it won't. But it's not going to do it because, oh, that will make us buddies with the U.S. That's not going to be the case at all. And honestly, I don't know if the Trump administration sees that or not. But if you look at the other side, and one of the things that got this administration to power was this idea. I mean, at one time he called China economic rapist, right? And you have a major contingency that only voted for Trump, but within the administration that has serious problems with the way China conducts trade. And that's starting to boil up more and more and more. And whether the two will come together, it's hard to say. But some point in time, that has to be reckoned with. That the administration will have to basically decide, well, we're going to do something about the China trade issues or not, and how much of that will affect what we do in the Western Pacific on the military side, instead of just basically following the old Obama. I mean, that's what they've been doing, is essentially letting off the Pacific Command and Pacific Fleet to sort of, go ahead, you run the show, we trust you.
Any other questions?
Morning.
Morning. Bud Cole, Professor Emeritus at the National War College, and before that, 30 years in the Navy as a surface warfare officer.
Maybe you should be up here then. Go ahead.
One small point is, I know that the Freedom of Navigation Ops as a formal program extended back at least to 1982, because that's when I did one. Also, a minor point, you said before, I think, that there had been a Chinese deliberate ship collision.
I'm sorry?
You had said earlier that after you mentioned the EP-3, that there had also been a deliberate collision caused by a Chinese ship.
Right, but not a Navy ship, but like a merchant ship, which I argue.
When was that?
That was when they were basically the American reconnaissance ships that were out there. They were colliding with. They were trying to put the grappling hooks on them and everything.
Well, they
like
never
that.
actually collided. That was impeccable. But a question that I certainly have been wrestling with is with respect to the Chinese island building, so-called, in the South China Sea. Where's the line there? Where's the counteraction that the U.S. might have taken or should take?
Do you want the one should have taken? I mean, way back when, certainly when Admiral Harris cited the wall of sand comments right before it became, Pacific Commanders, something should have been done. Now, what that something should have been that they go out there and quarantine it. I don't know. I mean, you're getting pretty close to war, but something should have been done other than nothing. I don't, something official should have been done. There hasn't even been any kind of protest launched, quite honestly, by the U.S. for something like that. Not officially. Officially, it's been pretty much a hands-off kind of thing, and they've certainly known about that before even the wall of sand comment. But have chose to ignore it. At the very least, they should have publicized that more.
What about President Obama's phone call to Xi Jinping in March of 2016 about Scarborough Shoals?
But that's a phone call. That's not official channels. There are other official channels that they can take. They can lodge an official protest. They can lodge some kind of official complaint or something along those lines. Do you think a phone call is enough for that? Well, so was putting the ships out there. For example, at one point in time, they were supposedly going out to build up more of the lands. They started putting some ships out there, some FONOPs or just sail by, and they pulled the ships back. So the argument could be made for more presence. The problem with that is we don't have enough ships for that kind of presence. It was effective in that it held things off for a little bit. But if you look right now, they've just resumed the island building, or whatever you want to call it, almost to a degree what they were doing before, in just the last several months.
I don't disagree. I
Yeah.
wondered what concrete steps we could have taken that would have effectively caused the Chinese to stop.
The only thing I can think of right now is to put more ships right there, most of the time, all the time, something along those lines. If we had more ships, that's the thing. Is right now one of the big problems I see, quite honestly, is that the U.S. Continues to do this. First of all, one third. That is, Army, Air Force, and Navy all get the same pot of money, even though our threat level doesn't really back that up. And then even within that is, everyone gets the same kind of pot of money, like in these little even out pockets, as opposed to saying we need to put more money. You're going to have to rebalance. Put more money in Asia Pacific. Put more money in Navy. Put more money into getting platforms out into where they need to be. And that's one of the things they could have done, but that didn't happen. And there's a lot of internal, domestic U.S. politics that keeps that from happening. That makes sense.
Was there another person back there?
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm also an intern here. Just a very quick question about One Belt, One Road, the Chinese infrastructure development project, kind of revitalizing the Silk Road along land and sea, especially on the maritime side. Have you seen or come across any connection with the development of One Belt, One Road, on the maritime side, and the Chinese military and Navy presence in the development areas and protecting their interests?
I would say it's all part of the same. I mean, in the U.S., we have this thing saying, okay, we're going to try diplomacy first and then military. China doesn't operate that way. For them, it's all combined. So they always kind of look, whatever will achieve the ends they want, or a combination of it. So putting a Navy out, for example, to secure certain areas, and then go and bid for projects in those areas, or offer aid to those areas. So you offer aid to those areas, they put an installation there, and then they man it for the security force that's, Chinese Army. I mean, they do the same things, and so they can secure, major spots, major choke points around the world for things like natural resources, logistics trains, and things like that. And right now, one of the big questions that they asked me, and they continue to ask the Navy officers I talk to whenever they get together, is how do you handle logistics trains? Especially to start with the whole idea of a carrier operation, these big, longer sea voyages. They've never really haven't done that in modern times. And they want an idea of how you do a logistics train. Where do you set up forward base ports, forward base service areas, and things like that? And how can you develop that along the way so you can keep your ships out, either for global tours or out at sea longer and things like that.
If not, then I'll ask one last
Okay.
question. Kind of in here is, recently you saw the WASP deployed out to the Pacific, getting the F-35Bs. I think it was last week too, right? Navy made an announcement that they were going to put prototype laser on one of the brand new amphibs, and that amphib is going to be the flagship at RIMPAC 2018, right? So the biggest at multinational exercise in the Pacific, and the Chinese will likely be there again, as they have the past two times. Is, I guess, your thoughts on any messaging or how kind of these kind of plays of Navy putting kind of new advanced capabilities out in that AOR, as a message to them and how they react.
Well, certainly. I mean, the one thing with the WASP, the F-35. Everyone thinks, what is this aircraft? And what they really need to think about is a fly-in sensor suite / computer system. The intelligence gathering capability of that aircraft is phenomenal. And that's even what they can say in the public realm, whatever, what they can say in classified realm. Well, I'm not privy to, but it's even like of a magnitude greater. And so that kind of, aircraft flying on a amphibious ship floating around in the Western Pacific there is really going to give the Chinese pause in certain areas. Yeah, I mean, it really is. To be able to collect, do kind of intelligence gathering that the U.S. has not had the capability of before getting in so close. That and the fact that, once again, you have embarked Marines on a ship like that, which has always bothered Chinese having Marines in that AOR. There's something about the Marines and their presence. They can go on shore for just about any kind of thing in the way Chinese just haven't been able to. So I think that particular thing is going to give the Chinese pause. They're going to look at that. They're going to, They're going to study that. They're going to think of ways to counter that, and plus to give them, I think, a chance for a little bit of intelligence gathering themselves, or they hope. As for the laser, what the administration said before, and what at least the Pentagon is saying now, is all their laser grades is going out to the Pacific, and the laser especially in these days of UAV proliferation gives a chance for a kind of defensive capability that makes it possible for these ships to get, I don't want to say closer to shore, but it will give them a chance to remain close to shore. Because right now, with some of the missile systems that have been developed, especially by the Chinese, getting these amphibious ships closer to shore has been a little bit iffy, a little bit riskier anyway. And so with something like this, something like a laser aboard, it will give them a chance if it's fully developed. But certainly putting on a ship out there and, you know, given for the world to see type of thing. Look what we've got. We've got a laser, and you know, and China doesn't. Russia doesn't. Not to this capability. So it does send a little bit of a message. It definitely does.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.
Great discussion.